this is just to confuse you. So I've got a slide deck up here behind me saying KEI. That's because today Sirca is actually launching the Australian Knowledge Economy Institute, which we'll be doing this afternoon. In fact, Paul Fletcher will be launching at the reception before the dinner tonight. So really what I wanted to talk about today is really where we're going with the Internet of Things and what the opportunity is, particularly in terms of government and particularly in terms of the changing role of public and private partnerships in a digital economy. And I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn here out of Australia in terms of work that's been done on this very important issue. But the first thing I wanted to start with is actually a quote from William Gibson, and I think it's already a theme that we've heard through this morning. In some ways, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And we've heard, I think, throughout the morning that there are many examples of how technology is being used to really drive and create change. And the Internet of Things is here in a very real way, but it's not distributed evenly, either geographically, but also I'd argue between the public and private sector. And this is one of the things that we really want to talk about, is how do we actually get a more democratised, if you like, access to the power of the Internet of Things, the power of data, so that all people can participate in the value creation that occurs out of that. So I'm going to actually share with you a slide from the Cisco Live from last week. So I shamelessly borrowed this from our colleagues at Cisco. And this is just a snapshot of the things that we've already heard today. There is an enormous opportunity out there. And Australia's opportunity is a $74 billion opportunity. I think what was really interesting to understand as well is in the last 2 years, 90% of our data has been created. So what's happening is we're having an exponential, a tsunami of data. And how do we make sense of that? And importantly, that 40% of that into the future is actually going to be created from sensors connected to the internet. And I think we've heard this theme as well, is look, really, it's not about the technology. And I think this is really important to understand. Yes, it's an incredible enabler, but really what's going to happen here, really where the change is going to happen is from the new business models that drive disruption from technology. And I think that government, as well as the private sector, as well as community and citizens, have an equal role to play in this. And the challenge is out there about how do we rethink the way that we deliver services to citizens. I have got logos of companies and I have got a timeline because essentially really what I wanted to communicate here is that we're really seeing enormous disruption happening in technology driven by new approaches to business models and how services are delivered to consumers. And we're seeing this rapid change that's actually emerging from this disruption. And we can see here we've got billions of people. We now have passed the point where there are more mobile phones than there are people on the planet. And so there is enormous connectivity already happening. And by 2017, we're looking to have 50 billion devices connected to the internet. So what does it mean for government? And I actually want to acknowledge Chris Vienne, who is here in the audience today. Chris was previously the Chief Innovation Officer for the World Bank and the Deputy CTO for the Obama White House. He actually pioneered a lot of work around open data when he was CTO in the city of San Francisco. And Chris has been talking globally around, really importantly, how do we reinvent the role of government in the digital economy? And critically, I think what's happening is we're seeing this massive disruption happening in the private sector, new business models, new value being created. And in some way, government, has been falling a bit behind that, frankly. And how do we actually change the role of government so that we can actually deliver better services to citizens? And I think the really important concept to understand around the idea of government as platform, there is never going to be enough money. There is never going to be enough people. There's never going to be enough tech. There is also going to be unending demands on government for more and more services and resources. How do we actually make that work? Well, part of it is through collaboration and tapping into that enormous creativity that's happening in technology through the private sector, through community groups, through citizens, through academia, through research. And so the role of government actually shifts from constantly doing to how do we actually tap that creativity and in effect be able to deliver better services by thinking of our role as a role of platform rather than necessarily having to do all the doing and heavy lifting on our own. And I think it's really important to understand this transition because the way government was designed, if you go back 1800s, is when we had, 200, 300 million people on the planet. We're rapidly approaching 9 billion people on the planet. And so how do we actually think about the structure of government and the business model of government itself? So what do these two things have in common? In fact, probably to this audience it's not that shocking, but we're very familiar with the role of government in building infrastructure, in building roads, in building things that are public goods that no one would ever build by themselves, but if we share them, we can all be better off. That's why government has a role in infrastructure. Government has also rapidly moved into the space of public and private partnerships. We didn't have enough capital, we raised it from the private sector, we found new ways of having public and private partnerships. This is exactly the same sort of concept that we need to think about when we think about the digital economy and how we can actually build knowledge infrastructure. We've heard a lot today about the knowledge economy. What we really need to think about is what are the business models to build the knowledge infrastructure. And this goes way beyond the pipes of NBN, obviously extremely important in terms of enabling connectivity, but really it's that next layer up of how do we collect data and how do we convert data to knowledge and hopefully to wisdom. So I want to give you 3 really concrete examples because Australia is actually a leader in this space. We are leaders in cloud compute, we are leaders in uptake of IoT, we are innovators, and we have traditionally really been very quick early adopters of technology. And we have some homegrown examples which I just want to talk about that have actually looked at how we work in this new digital economy in a public and private partnership way. So Sirca, who I work for as the Chief Strategy Advisor, is actually one of those. So Sirca, as you heard, was created in 1997. It was created out of a research initiative. It's now owned by Australia's 40 universities, Australia and New Zealand's 40 universities. And what Sirca started doing back in 2002 is actually working with financial markets data. So Sirca now is the world's biggest repository of financial data. It takes every stock exchange trade, every company announcement, every bid, every offer from every stock exchange in the world, about 2 million transactions a second, millisecond stamps those, and then actually normalises it, stitches it together, delivers it up through to 3 sets of customers. One through its channel partner Thomson Reuters to the world's financial markets. So more than 600 financial institutions around the world use it for high-frequency trading and algo trading. But really importantly, it also gives it to government. And it's used, by example, from our own Reserve Bank of Australia, by the Fed Reserve in the States, to actually deal with compliance and monitoring of insider trading and to drive policy around how we deal with financial markets. Extremely important social public policy outcome. It's also provided to researchers around the world and in fact has spawned a whole field of new financial and business research, resulting in something like 13,000 new papers and a whole new field of academic endeavour because the data was made available. So a really important initiative. The other thing that has happened here is that Sirca is now financially independent of public funding. Yes, it started with a public investment, but now is completely financially independent and runs commercial grade infrastructure as a service. So Better Work, which is a program that I ran for the World Bank and the UN, was doing a similar thing about the same time as Mike. I should have mentioned actually the founder and CEO, Mike Bryce, is here in the audience as well, of Sirca. At the same time that Mike was creating Sirca, we were creating Better Work, which actually works across the world's apparel supply chains. I'm not going to go into all the detail. Essentially, though, what we were trying to do is say, how do we solve a problem of looking at improving labour standards and productivity in the world's apparel industry? And there was a very clear business problem. Every single buyer around the world has its own standards, which was auditing every single factory. Every single factory was experiencing about 50 of these a year, all of them paying for it. And all, I have to say, are pretty marginal quality. So what we did is actually created a system, again, as a social enterprise, where we did collected the data about working conditions, put it all into one place, a trilingual website, which we then gave access to international buyers who paid for the service, as well as to the factories who needed the data as well. We then gave it to government so that they could improve public policy and improve the way that they were dealing with labour regulation. And we gave it to researchers, who then have created a whole new field of research around human-centred development, which is in turn been driving a whole lot of policy around pro-poor development from the World Bank and from member countries. So same sort of concept, Mike beavering over here with Sirca, me beavering away in the World Bank and the UN, creating better work. Same concept of pooling data, sell it to business, get financial resources in, give it to government, give it to researchers. And so essentially what we did is we pulled that capability together into SenseT, which is a program that's based in Tasmania. And again, I'd like to acknowledge Amanda, who's here as the director of SenseT, now that I've moved to Sirca. And what we did with SenseT is say, well, how can we actually take real-time data and create a digital view of our state? So not a city, but a whole economy. Pull that together and actually solve real problems in our community to help people make better decisions about how to optimise production, reduce impact on the environment. Again, same concept, pull data together, make it available to the private sector, but then at the same time, give it to government, at the same time, give it to researchers, so that every time we had a new question, we didn't have to go and collect the data again. And so essentially, what we've been really doing is saying, what is the new business model in the digital economy about how do you create public-private partnerships that can create value and democratise data and actually create as a service. So what do they all share in common? Those three wavy lines is what's often referred to as the Triple Helix. I'm looking at Alts because I'm sure he's very familiar with this. And the Triple Helix is really a concept that's pretty simple. It says government, business and researchers have a really important role together to actually help creating transformation, and we do better if we collaborate, and that we can create more than our individual parts by working together. And that's essentially really the challenge that we're seeking to address. And I think the other thing that's incredibly important about this, and I think we've heard it again from many of the speakers this morning, we need open standards. The internet is not some abstract concept where it just automatically happens. It's human and socially mediated. So therefore we need to create the platforms, the systems, the models that actually reflect our human values and what we want to achieve as a society. And that's really why we're very much focused in how we do this together to actually deliver benefit to our community. That's why we're creating the Knowledge Economy Institute, which we're going to be launching today, and thank you, Susan, for allowing us to do it as part of this conference. And really our purpose is to, how do we actually scale knowledge through data? How do we actually create the new knowledge economy by bringing together data, but really importantly, making that transformation into knowledge, and that knowledge that can be applied in a whole lot of different human endeavour. So, oh my goodness, we'll have to change that slide. It doesn't project very well. Essentially what we're looking at is building on the capability that we've already created with SenseT and with Sirca, actually creating a whole lot of data sources, importantly public and private. We often think about open data as being something where government releases data to the private sector, and yes, that's very important. But equally important is actually bringing in private sector data and making that available in a combined way. And we already do this with Sirca. For example, we work with data providers in mortgage finance, in finance around credit cards, and you can combine that with public sector data around issues of income support, and you can create, through combining these data sets across the public and private sector, understand things like financial inclusion, stress, financial stress in our community. How do we better target policy to get better outcomes? And so actually combining data across the public and private sector can give us whole new visions of information we haven't seen before. So you can see the faint outline of Australia there, including Tasmania at the bottom where I live. But essentially what we're looking at is how we combine our partners together with a whole series of labs. And some of you may have seen that we launched at Cisco Live last week the partnership with Cisco for an Internet of Everything lab, together with Sirca as the partner, and we have a hub based in Sydney but also in Curtin University with Woodside in Western Australia. So that's our idea, is how do we actually build that out, particularly focusing on different capabilities across the economy. And really importantly is to understand that, you know, I sometimes get concerned in government public policy that we focus on traditional industry sectors and somehow we just kind of park the ICT thing over there as being an enabler. Yes, it is an enabler, but it's an enabler that can help us transform the competitiveness of our existing industries and businesses, but also create the new knowledge-based exports and jobs of the future. And that's what we need to actually create really a thriving and a community with well-being. So the KEI basically will have 4 things: a data platform, which is scalable based on open standards, working with our commercial partners to bring the best of tech that we have into this capability. It's really important that we can actually not have to collect new data every time we have a new question. And this is particularly important for research, where we see billions of dollars literally spent in research and development, you know, from federal governments through into universities in the publicly funded research sector. And unfortunately, a lot of that is spent recreating again and again and again the back end of every single little tiny project. Whereas if we approach it as a common infrastructure problem, we can get enormous efficiencies of scale and we can get much faster outcomes. Secondly, we're really interested in big data and understanding innovation itself. What are the clusters? Where are we actually putting our research dollars, and how is that translating into startups? How is that translating into things like mobility of personnel, which is a very good indicator of where you've kind of got activity and vibrancy in your startup community? We know that Australia, and particularly Sydney, is the centre of data-intensive startups in the world. Number 1. It's the number 1 in terms of data-intensive startups in the world. How do we actually tap into understanding what's happening there, and how do policy interventions can be made more efficient and effective to drive that? We're looking at a series of brokered projects where we bring together end users together with the best research talent that we have across Australia. And that's why it's particularly important having an organisation that sits above the 40 universities and actually is able to say, okay, where do we find the best talent to actually address this particular problem? And finally, a series of innovation tools, and I was really encouraged hearing Steve talk this morning from Singapore about the importance of understanding it's not just about research, it's about innovation and startups. And how do we actually help startups use common infrastructure and give them the tools to take ideas from lab into the hands of people and end users to make that a reality. So our initial founding partners with the KEI are listed there. We're very excited to be working on this initiative, and we see it as being something what we want to grow it as a $60 million institute that's really addressing concrete and real problems to help us drive forward how we make Australia really genuinely a leader in the knowledge economy. And finally, I really wanted to leave you with a concept, and this comes from Mike Bracken, who leads the UK effort in terms of data, is in the analogue world, what really happens is that policy dictates delivery. So in the traditional ways government works, what we do is we do an analysis, we look at all the other experience, we set up a policy, we then hand it over to executors who then implement it, and then at the end of that process, we get to a point and we say, did that work, and we try to evaluate it. In the digital world, it's completely different. In the digital world and a government that's digitally engaged, really what we need to say is that everything that we do, every intervention is in its way a little experiment. And if we actually track and use data, it actually then informs policy. This is fundamentally a concept that can shift the way that we are delivering government services and our efficiency and effectiveness in the way that we actually do that. And I think that's really the opportunity. It's not going to happen by accident. It's going to happen by architecting for it. It's going to happen through collaboration with government, with business, with the research sector, and it's going to happen by having platforms that are based on open infrastructure, data that we can reshare, and that we can really focus on how we address real problems for real people. So I come back when I started, it's not about the tech. It's actually about understanding those real problems and really working together to actually address them and use technology to deliver. Thanks.